Hi, and welcome back to Traffic Jam Live News. Traffic Jam Live shines a spotlight on the shadow of human trafficking right here in the U.S. Very few have any idea how serious the situation is for girls, children under the age of 18, right here in the U.S. with human trafficking. There's a thing called Metcalfe's Law that says the value, the power of a network is proportional to the squared number of people in that network. Okay, that's a mouthful, that's a formula, but the gist is you add value, you add power to that network. So if you're new or relatively new to Traffic Jam Live, we encourage you to subscribe, like, share these posts, share posts of other anti-trafficking organizations. That's where we build the value, the teamwork that can take on and disrupt and dismantle human trafficking. Today, we've got Sophia Flot-Warner and her interview with Megan Cutter, the director of the National Human Trafficking Hotline at Polaris. Two amazing women doing significant things in the battle against human trafficking. Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks, Bo. Our guest today is Megan Cutter. She's the director of the Polaris-operated U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline. She has worked for the Trafficking Hotline since 2013, starting out as a hotline advocate, responding to contacts to the hotline in both English and Spanish. In her current role, Megan provides strategic oversight of the program to ensure a survivor-centered and trauma-informed response. Megan leads a team of managers to promote consistency and continuity across the department, as well as to design, test, and refine innovative strategies and technologies to ensure optimal case response. What admirable work Megan does. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm just so happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. We are so delighted to have you with us. So we are going to hit the ground running. What would you tell any person watching who is a victim or survivor, and you can speak to both, in the world of human trafficking?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, you're not alone. And whenever you're ready to reach out and to get help, there are resources like the National Human Trafficking Hotline that are there to listen, to answer questions, to provide support. And also that, what you've experienced is real, and we believe you. The resources that exist to help will believe you. And whenever you're ready, we're here. And I think also that one of the things that is important for the trafficking hotline when someone reaches out for help is to provide choice about what you want to see happen next. And so knowing that if you reach out to a resource like the trafficking hotline is that you'll have choices, and that trafficking is often an experience that takes away choice, that takes away autonomy. And so for us, it's really important that in those first steps in leaving, or even in recovery, if maybe someone's been out of their situation for a while, allowing for choice and decision-making on the part of the survivor to decide what they want to see happen next. So knowing that if you do decide to reach out, if you are ready, that no one is going to put whatever happens next on you. That's a choice that you get to make in the recovery process. And I think that's hugely important.
Awesome. Those are powerful messages. So would you please share with us a victory, a good story, a good outcome that you and your organization have recently experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. And these are really the things I think that, help keep us going. And unfortunately, through the National Hotline, we don't always get to find out what happens. This is one of the first things I say when I train new team members is once we get someone connected to the right resource, we might never hear from them again. And if we do hear from them again, it might be because something didn't work out and they need help. So whenever we do, hear back from survivors that we've supported, it can be really impactful. So we recently actually heard from someone who had contacted the hotline a couple of years ago, and we connected them with resources and helped them with what they needed. And they let us know that since they talked to us, they've left their trafficking situation, moved on, begun their healing process. They went to school, they've got a job, they've got a support system. I mean, this was like the nicest email I've ever read. And in this case, this happened several years ago, but many of the people who worked with this person still work for the trafficking hotline. And so we were able to say, hey, look at, what we were able to do. And that was a really amazing moment to be able to share with the team, and also to be able to hear from this person about their experience, and to be grounded in the impact that the trafficking hotline can have. So we're really grateful for that. And we're grateful for anyone who does choose to reach back out, because, reaching out to us is often one of the harder moments that people face. And so to be willing to reach out and say, hey, I'm willing to revisit that because I'd like to say thank you is very meaningful.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. These are the things that keep us going, right? These are the stories that keep us going and give us hope. And hopefully, as we share all these stories, it will give hope to those who may be caught up in this. We want to start by shattering some common myths and misconceptions about human trafficking. Would you share that with us, Megan?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that we're starting with this, because I think that folks have a lot of ideas about human trafficking that they've heard in the media. And, it sounds, when you hear the words human trafficking, you don't necessarily get a picture of what the crime actually looks like. So one of the most common misconceptions that we hear at Polaris and through the National Human Trafficking Hotline is that human trafficking happens when someone kidnaps a random adult or child kind of off the street in this random act. And, although that does sometimes happen, that's really not the vast majority of trafficking situations. Trafficking is often perpetrated by someone who knows the victim, whether it's someone who's a friend, a family member, an intimate partner, may even be someone that the victim loves and trusts. And what traffickers do is use that love and trust to exert power and control over the individuals they exploit. So I think that's a really good place to start in terms of myths and misconceptions, because particularly around what we see in the media about trafficking is sometimes that it's like someone gets snatched off the street, and that's just really not the nature of this crime. So that's the first I would highlight. Another one just that I think is important as we kick off our conversation is often the dialogue around trafficking is focused on sex trafficking, but labor trafficking is the other form of trafficking. And we actually believe there's more labor trafficking happening in the United States and worldwide than sex trafficking. But there's just less attention to the crime. I think there are some additional barriers to reporting or for folks reaching out for help. And so that's an important piece I would highlight as well.
Well, thank you. Because yes, some of those things you mentioned, those are my first thoughts, right? I imagine people coming right off the street and just grabbing innocent kids. And so you're right. That's thank you for busting that myth for me.
Of course.
So your work is focused specifically on the hotline. Would you share with our audience a little about the hotline and how it works?
Of course. So since 2007, Polaris has operated the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, and it's a program of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So it's funded in part by the U.S. government, but operated independently by Polaris, a nonprofit. It's also supported in part by private donations. And the hotline is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year resource for victims and survivors, those who are supporting them, those who maybe are adjacent to a trafficking situation in some way and are looking for support. And people can reach out to us via phone, text message. We have an online chat function. There's also an online reporting form that people can fill out. And you can also email the hotline. So there's lots of different ways for folks to reach out to us if they're seeking help for themselves or for someone else. And there are a couple of different buckets of ways that the trafficking hotline can provide support. So one of the big ones is through connecting with service provision. So that might be a safe place to stay, that might be legal assistance, counseling, any type of assistance that someone who's exiting or maybe has been out of a trafficking situation for many years, but needs some support related to their experience, connecting to those choices. Another bucket is through help reporting to law enforcement, specifically law enforcement who are trained in human trafficking and who have knowledge of this crime. And this is something some survivors choose to do and is part of their journey for seeking justice. And others, they're not interested, whether because they've had negative experiences with law enforcement or maybe there's some fear around that choice. And so for us, engagement with law enforcement is really something we try to create as much choice around as possible, because For people, it's really part of what they're looking for, and for others, maybe it's not. And then the third bucket of what the hotline can help with is a little more nebulous, but not any less important. And that is safety planning and kind of helping people when they're in a stage of contemplation. Maybe they've been being exploited for quite a while, and they're starting to think about what would be a safe way to leave the situation. What might their choices be if they were to leave? What might life look like? And so that's often kind of that first piece, that first conversation we have with someone who's reaching out. And then once we start the conversation, people can choose from any of those three buckets I mentioned and can be kind of in all three or just one or the other. And our goal really is to connect with resources locally, wherever that person is.
That's pretty amazing. You guys do a whole lot through just the hotline. I love it. I love it. So are there any trends that you're seeing emerge through the hotline as you do all this work?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that's, I think, unique and interesting about the National Human Trafficking Hotline is that it can serve as a lens into how trafficking happens in the United States and what trafficking looks like. An important caveat is that the purpose of the hotline is not to collect data or information. So our first priority is always helping victims and survivors. And that means we only ask questions that we need to ask in order to support them. And we're not asking the same standard set of questions on every call. So our data is useful, but certainly not exhaustive. And there are, areas of it that could be a little stronger if we were to be focused on data, but that's not our goal. So those caveats aside, some of the trends that we're seeing, I think that are really interesting and impactful, particularly around COVID, is that we looked at the month of April 2020 and compared it to April 2019, as well as the period sort of right before stay-at-home orders were put in place. So February 15th through March 15th, 2020. And we used that as a control period for April 2020. And what we found is that the types of needs people had when reaching out to the hotline had changed in April 2020 compared to those periods. And I think what we saw was a almost 40% increase in crisis cases, and then a nearly 20% increase in cases where someone was looking for emergency shelter. And so that tells you, and I think if we all think back to those initial moments of the pandemic, where there was uncertainty, where there was a lot of job loss right at those first few weeks, where their need was more urgent, it was more time sensitive, and people were having a harder time getting access to resources. And that's really reflected in what we saw on the hotline in those initial weeks and months. So I think that's a trend that is really important. And when we think about connections between COVID and vulnerability, and how we know that populations who are the most vulnerable in our society are the most impacted by COVID, that's also true of trafficking. Traffickers exploit vulnerability. So when we see something like the pandemic, it's this magnified effect. So that's a trend I'd really highlight because it's very timely and important, and I think can help us understand how to support survivors in this moment.
That's excellent information that you all are gathering, even though it's not your focus. But I love the fact that you moved further than what your focus is to find more ways to help the survivors with this information. So that's awesome.
Thank you.
And one thing I really admire is that your organization has a strong focus on survivors. Would you tell us how you incorporate their expertise from their lived experience into crafting solutions to helping them?
Absolutely. And this is a really core piece of the way that Polaris does its work, and something that we think is really, really important. And so the first thing is just to know that we believe that survivors are the true experts in their situations. And so we really think that working alongside and in partnership with survivors is the way to develop solutions to combat trafficking, because they know, what might have worked for them, what type of support they might have needed or still need, and also, have this lived experience, and that's really significant. And so, a couple of different programs at Polaris really consciously incorporate survivor experience. One of those is our data analysis program, and the reason for that is to ensure that the experiences and the stories we're telling through data aren't just anonymous data points, but rather are really contextualized with real life experience. experience. So that has been really significant. We recently launched a national survivor study, which is a coordinated effort to supplement the data that I just talked about from the national hotline and to use insights from survivors themselves to tell a larger or broader story. And my final piece on this, I think that is maybe the most important, I probably should have said it first, is that it's really important that we compensate survivors for their labor, for their work when they're sharing lived experience. And also that we look at survivors as folks who can share beyond just their lived experience, but that are full individuals and people who have lots to offer professionally and personally that is not just connected to what they experienced during their trafficking situation. And I think that is a really important, that plus compensation for work are two ways that the field can avoid re-exploiting folks and instead bringing them in and using solutions or coming towards solutions rather together.
That's amazing. So this is a perfect segue for you to share with our audience about the Survivors Gallery. There's some beautiful works of art showcased there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. And as part of Polaris's efforts to center survivors, we launched the Survivor Gallery on our website in January of 2020. And all of the things that you can find there are self-submitted by survivors with all backgrounds, experiences, and what they've chosen to submit is really different. So there's artwork, poetry, photography, and this is really a way to create space for survivor experience in an area of the field that we haven't quite explored yet. So we're really excited about that, and glad you mentioned it.
Awesome. Yeah, I had a chance to go in and read some of the poetry and some of the stories, and it was really touching.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So I read a little bit about your work surrounding labor trafficking and migrant workers. Would you please tell us more about that work? It's not an area I usually think of for labor trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really important part of our work for a lot of reasons. One, because migrant workers are particularly vulnerable. And I mentioned earlier that connection between vulnerability and trafficking. But we also hear quite a bit from migrant workers, particularly those working in agriculture, through the hotline, because when folks enter the United States with a temporary work visa, they get our phone number. They get this packet that says, know about your rights, and it includes our number. And often when people first reach out to us, they're not necessarily connecting their situation with human trafficking. They're calling because maybe there's an issue with their paycheck or their boss said something to them that didn't feel very good. And part of the job of the hotline advocate, the person, the folks who answer the hotline calls and text messages, is to start with that conversation around the issue that the person first presents and talk a little bit about what human trafficking is and explain, particularly for labor, human trafficking is when someone is compelled to stay in their job through force, fraud, or coercion. And if they were to try to leave or quit or resign, there'd be some kind of negative consequence to themselves or someone they love. And so talking through that in a way that's accessible, that's easy to understand, and that resonates with people's real experience. Because if you say, hey, are you a human trafficking victim? A, not everyone identifies that way. And B, what does that really mean? And so part of the hotline's role is to have that conversation. And what we often find is that workers who are calling about pay or treatment on their job are also experiencing other forms of exploitation that can rise to the level of trafficking. And so in both of those scenarios, we can connect people into any of those three buckets I mentioned earlier of support with reporting to law enforcement, safety planning, or connection to services, or all three. So that's what's happening on the hotline. And then Polaris has a program that focuses on ending labor trafficking of migrant guest workers in the United States. So that's kind of the preventative piece, while the hotline side is responding to what's coming in. And that program is really focused on closing loopholes in guest worker policy that create space for exploitation, that kind of create within the system some vulnerabilities that traffickers exploit. And so that's a really important way that our programs connect and have this cohesive solution and this cohesive approach to combating trafficking.
That's amazing. You guys do some really powerful work.
Thank you.
So I was really excited to learn that Polaris worked with Consejo Ciudadano, a respected Mexican nonprofit, to launch that country's first National Human Trafficking Hotline. How does the hotline collaborate with other hotlines, both in the United States and internationally?
Yeah, this is one of the most, I think, amazing pieces about the National Human Trafficking Hotline is our relationships with other hotlines, both in the United States and out of the United States. So first, I'll start kind of internationally. We do get a lot of calls from people who are located in other places or who maybe were exploited in the United States but have now returned to their home countries or vice versa. Maybe they're US citizens being exploited abroad. And so what's important in those scenarios is to make sure that we have a resource to connect them with where they're located so they can get whatever support they need and make sure that they are connected to those resources. So in Mexico, we have our partners at Consejo Ciudadano who run the national hotline there. And we have a really good referral process where we share cases with each other as long as we have the permission of the person calling and seeking help. And then we have a similar partnership with the Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking who operate their national hotline. So we've got this North American model that allows us to make sure that people in any part of the continent are connected to the right place. And then within the United States, we work with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, and a lot of other hotlines to make sure that if we hear from someone who maybe hasn't experienced trafficking, but they've been sexually abused, that we can get them to the right place so that we don't answer the phone and say, that sounds really terrible, good luck. That instead we say, we're so sorry you experienced that. Doesn't sound like human trafficking, but here's the right place. Let's connect you directly to that other hotline so you don't have to dial the phone again, so you don't have to hang up and then get ready to make another phone call. Because I think making that first phone call is one of the hardest parts. So we try to make that as easy as possible and remove any barriers.
That's excellent. That's real collaboration. And I agree totally that keeping them in that phone call because they've built up the courage to do it in the first place is key. So kudos for that. So you all have advocates, of course, people who want to help you. How do you communicate with your advocates and how does Polaris help them to be of service to victims of trafficking?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things as a national organization and as an organization that operates a national hotline is to really connect into the work that's happening in communities on the ground and the important things that they're doing. So our goal as the hotline is to serve as a connector. And if someone calls us from Miami, Florida, to be able to say, here are some organizations in Miami, Florida that work with people like you, people with your citizenship status, people of your gender identity, or who've experienced the same situation as you, and who can help with whatever your need is. And then if someone calls from Nebraska, same thing. And although the infrastructure might look different in different places, that we're connecting into whatever that system is. So we have a referral directory, which is there's some of it that's public and then some of it that's a little bit broader that's internal to hotline staff that shows trafficking specific service providers, so shelters, legal assistance, et cetera, throughout the United States. And then we're able to connect with those folks via phone or via text message and make a direct connection between the survivor and the resource that might be able to help them. So that's a big piece of our work. And we wouldn't be able to operate the hotline without being able to tap into what's being done on the ground. So that's, I think, the most significant piece when we talk about working with those who are advocates and who are fighting this fight every day.
That's pretty amazing. We were talking in another interview about the importance of all of the organizations linking arms. And you seem to have cornered the market on linking arms and collaboration. So that's perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's so important. And one of the things I remember I started off as an advocate is when I was able to find someone in the city or town or rural area where a survivor I was working with who was really understood what the local landscape looked like, that's when I knew we're going to be able to help this person. Because if I could find someone who could work together with me to advocate for them, or who was willing to really take it all on themselves, that was a way to get to a solution. So I totally agree.
Perfect. So I saw a great variety of ways that people can raise funds for Polaris: Facebook, Instagram, Pledge Your Birthday, and a custom fundraiser on your website. Would you share with our audience about all the ways that they can help in the fight?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned a lot of ways to donate or create fundraisers on our behalf through social media, and those are awesome. But another way, especially if financial support isn't something that you can do right now, there are definitely other ways to get involved. And a big one is through supporting legislation that's going to support survivors of trafficking. And then also learning more about how trafficking really works and helping to educate others. So thinking about some of those myths and misconceptions we talked about at the beginning, making sure that as someone interested in learning about trafficking, that you learn how it really happens. And when someone says, oh yeah, all human trafficking is like the movie Taken, you can say, actually, no, here's what I learned from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And the other thing that I think is maybe not as maybe wouldn't think of initially, but that is important, is volunteering in your community, not just to fight trafficking, but the factors that lead to trafficking. And so trafficking is a reflection of a lot of our societal ills. And so we're reckoning with systemic racism, with extreme poverty for many folks, with a houselessness crisis, all of these different things. And those factors enable trafficking to happen. And so being a part of those fights and those areas of advocacy can have an impact on trafficking survivors, even if you're not directly working on human trafficking. And so I think that's an important thing to make sure people know about and can be empowered with that knowledge.
I love that, because you've given people other options and other ways to help. Because, like you said, not everybody has money, but this is great. This is great information. I'm so excited about this interview. So would you share with us about your partners, the ones that focus on helping with the hotline?
Of course, absolutely. So Polaris has a couple of different corporate partners that donate in-kind resources to the hotline that can be used to fill gaps. So a lot of times what we see is that maybe a survivor was trafficked somewhere that's not where their family is, and they're looking for help to return home, and they want to receive wraparound services there, but not in the place where they were trafficked. So we work with Southwest and with Delta to provide flight vouchers and points that we can use in conjunction with our partners on the ground to help survivors relocate for things like that, or maybe if they have a court date they need to go to, or whatever the case may be, where air travel is a piece of their recovery. That's something that the National Hotline can help with. And then we also work with Choice Hotels and with Wyndham brand hotels who offer us points to use hotels as a shelter option for survivors when there's not another option. So again, we work in partnership with people on the ground to administer those resources, and we're able to say, there's no shelter bed for 1 or 2 nights. Let's do a hotel for 1 or 2 nights if that's a safe option for this person. And then when the shelter bed opens, they have this choice. So it can be a stopgap. We also work with rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft to do a similar thing. So those partnerships are really with companies who've identified alongside Polaris, here are the gaps in supporting survivors, and here are some resources that might help fill in those gaps. So that's a really exciting piece of our work, and something, we're particularly with rideshare, that's something we're piloting right now, and we hope to expand. And particularly with COVID, the hotel resources have been really helpful. So we're super grateful for those partners, and we hope to really continue being able to offer those resources because they can make a big difference.
Yeah, that all sounds really amazing. So how can a company or organization become a partner?
Great question. So they can visit Polaris's website and also reach out to our corporate partnerships team. And that email is corporateengagement@polarisproject.org. And that team can talk a little bit more about what a collaboration might look like.
Awesome. So we're going to take a different turn here. We're going to get a little personal with you. We want to hear your story, right? Tell us how you first became involved in the fight against human trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share that. So one of my first positions kind of in the working world was doing advocacy around workers' rights and around changing policy to impact the well-being of workers. And a lot of the folks I worked with were actually survivors of trafficking who were continuing to be employed in sectors kind of adjacent to where they were exploited. And what they were hoping to do was, this, for example, domestic work. That was a job that they loved, a skill set that they had, and they wanted to continue working in this industry, but they didn't want to be re-exploited or re-trafficked. And so they were organizing and advocating for change within that industry. And so I was working adjacent to that and just really saw some amazing leadership from survivors, and particularly from folks who maybe didn't speak English as a first language. And as someone who has a second language that I did not learn in my home, thinking about like how people access systems in a language that is not their own and how challenging that is really was something I wanted to work on whenever I, continued my career. And so when I found this part-time hotline advocate job at Polaris, where I could take calls in Spanish and English, and where I could really help people navigate a complicated system to get the resources they need, I was pretty sold. They said, you've got to work overnights. And I was like, I'm not sure. And it really worked out. And 7.5 years later, I'm still here. And so that's sort of how my trajectory happened. And once I started at Polaris and started on the hotline, I just really believe in the work and believe in hotlines as a resource for people. So that's how I got involved. And, I intend to stay involved. I think this is a really important issue and something where I can use my voice and my privilege and my power to impact and support others. So I'm very grateful for that.
So
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Megan. This has been an amazing interview. I have just thoroughly enjoyed my time with you. Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think that's it. You really covered the gamut, Sophia. And, thank you so much for having me and for creating space for this conversation and getting the word out about human trafficking and about the resources that are available. So just want to say thank you and express my gratitude.